So chapter 2 of my forthcoming book is called In the Beginning Was Bhakti. So basically the title has to do with Bhakti. Where does Bhakti come from? How we as humans are generally quite preoccupied with the notion of origins. Where do I come from? Where everything does come from? So at one point we may ask ourselves, where does Bhakti come from? And of course, if Bhakti comes from something else, maybe that source of Bhakti may be higher than Bhakti. But of course, since Bhakti for us Gaudiyas is the supreme reality, even for Krishna Bhagavan himself, the conclusion will be Bhakti comes from Bhakti. Bhakti is its own source. That's stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam with the quote Bhaktya Sanjataya Bhaktya, which basically means Bhakti comes from Bhakti, which is another way of saying Bhakti comes from the Bhakta, or Bhakti comes from Sadhu Sangha. Sadhu Sangha is the birthplace of devotion. Chaitanya Charitamrita confirms this. Krishna Bhakti Janmamul, how is Sadhu Sangha? Krishna Prem Janmatin Ho Punarmukyanga. The root cause place for the birth of Bhakti is Sadhu Sangha. Even when one reaches Prem, Sadhu Sangha remains a Mukhya Anga, one of the main limb for one's life in eternity. There are many quotes that I'm sharing in my book. In these short clips, I'm just mentioning here and there some words, but actually, as I mentioned, there are thousands of scriptural evidence that I'm trying to compile in my forthcoming work. So in the beginning, it was Bhakti. Srila Rupa Goswami mentions the 9 stages of Bhakti beginning with Shraddha, but before Shraddha, he says Adho, Shraddha, and so on. Sadhu Sangha, Bhajan, Kriya, Nartha, Nibrita, and so on. So Adho means in the beginning it was. In the beginning it was Bhakti. In the beginning it was Sadhu Sangha actually. This Adho is interpreted by different commentators by referring to a Sadhu Sangha that comes before Shraddha. Because in order to experience Shraddha, first comes a particular type of Sadhu Sangha which gives place for Shraddha, which gives place again for another type of Sadhu Sangha where we more consciously engage in. So the idea here is that the sadhus are like bumblebees, like carrying the nectar and pollinating our hearts, flower-like, lotus-like hearts, carrying the pollen of Bhakti, putting in one heart, and eventually in that heart that may be carried to another heart, and so on. For further establishing this conclusion, I refer in this chapter to the Madhurya Kadambini, and the very beginning chapters of Madhurya Kadambini, which Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad makes a very extraordinary presentation on Bhakti's coming from Bhakti, Bhakti's independence, Bhakti's own will, individual volition, and how it works in its own self-determined dynamic, if you will. The Bhagavatam also refers to this same notion with the term Jadrichaya, which is a term that appears at least 50 times throughout the book. So Jadrichaya generally is the term translated as by one's own independent will, indicating independence. So this is a very important point that I try to establish in this section. Rupa Goswami uses the term Ati Bhagyena, by extreme good fortune, we get in touch with Bhakti. But special causeless mercy, Bhakti approaching ourselves through her own volition, if you will. Why? And I developed that in this chapter as well, because Bhagavan himself, he does not have full experience of our particular situation as Bada Jivas or conditioned souls. So he extends his Kripa Shakti, or his mercy-giving potency, to his bhaktas who have an experience of what we have gone through, and thus can be fully compassionate according to our experience. Because Bhagavan can only experience what we call cognitive empathy, to know the other person is suffering, and of course try to do something about it. But the bhaktas can experience also affective empathy, which means they do not only know what we are going through, but they have gone through that as well. So their compassion can be more comprehensive, and therefore Bhagavan has given from time without beginning this Kripa Shakti officially to his bhaktas to distribute here and there. So the conclusion of this chapter is made mostly that not only Bhakti comes from Bhakti and we receive devotion by the agency of the sadhu, but Krishna himself is following Bhakti in her own independent movements. That's the very identity of Bhagavan. The Bhagavatam says, Bhagavan Bhakti Bhakti Bhakta Bhakti Mam. Bhagavan is the Bhakta of his bhaktas, the devotee of his devotees. Wherever Bhakti goes, he follows accordingly. So we are trying to follow in those footsteps as well.